Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, there you go. Loud and clear. How are you guys?
Good. I was gonna see if I can get rid of the background, but we could let it play. It might be interesting.
You can let that run. That's fine. No problem. How are you today?
Yeah, swell and swole. And
I didn't actually expect you guys to be out of bed on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. 9
well,
o'clock.
look at our eyes. Look at those puffy eyes. It
Diet.
was a challenge.
I might have read that a little bit wrong. Did you have a big weekend or quiet?
Yeah, I almost got swallowed up by soy six pitaya as usual. I made it out
Nice.
alive though.
Very nice, cool. All right, well, so I know that we're going to be talking about recombinant IGF-1 use today, and to be honest with you, I probably could spend 5 hours talking about this. So maybe if we just jump in, I'll just let you know I've given you permission to record this, so I think you could probably see that already. You're recording this, correct?
Okay, record and recording. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So you should be able to get a copy of this at your own, no problem. Okay. So why don't you guys lead off? I have a sense of what we're going to be talking about today. Basically, the summary would be, so recombinant IGF is a performance enhancing drug. Who's a potential candidate? Why would we consider using it rather than, say, recombinant human growth hormone? Do you need to use the both of them at the same time? Which variants use, dosages and deployment frameworks, and obviously in an organic fashion, any and all questions that you want to ask along the way. So I have set aside, an hour and a half. I don't know how long you guys have. I think that's probably long enough before people start falling asleep, quite frankly.
Okay.
But I guess I have some things I would like to put on the table. I'm sure you guys have got some questions. So I think we should try and just approach this in an organic fashion and far away. So I think this is a real world application from what you said the other day, Mike. You were looking at putting together a protocol for the immediate future that would leverage this compound. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, right now I'm in the middle of leaning down to get myself primed to try and put on some mass again.
Okay.
So ideally, I've never used IGF-1 DES before. And so from what I've got from anecdotal reviews from friends and friends of friends, you know how that goes.
Sure.
They've told me it's actually very effective, and I've seen some pretty good looking results. So I wanted to, because I don't have any kind of protocol, I have no experience with it, I wanted to ask somebody who knows.
Okay, cool. All right. I'm more than happy to disclose all of that. I do, along the way, want to see if I could add some value for other people that might be listening as well. So some of what we talk about, I'm sure you will already know. Yeah. And it may well lead to some interesting and pertinent questions. The thing that kind of struck me when we spoke, we just had a very, very brief conversation, no more than a paragraph on Facebook, was you kind of set a time frame which was very short, like an acute, rapid growth burst. Can you expand on that for me?
I was initially told with the DES that 40 days is kind of the max, but from what I've read, it can be as much as 90 before you desensitize. So
okay, so
it's information. That's why I'm coming to you.
Okay, so it's based on the idea that the compound is effective for an acute period of time, that you have your eye on a short window of time. Is that
yeah, that's right.
Fair? Okay, cool. Now I better position that. Okay, so let me just start off by saying, and I know that people listening to this that have heard me speak before, I'm very passionate about this. In my opinion, a lot of the information that we're presented as a tribe about the application of enhancement tools is of very, very poor quality. I am an outspoken advocate of the fact that I think that so many of the things that we do just don't make any sense when you sit down and have a detailed conversation with it. A lot of the conversations are based on people say, what's the strongest drug there is? This is the starting point for most conversations. People want to immediately go to the most powerful compound that's available for them at that moment in time, rather than having a conversation about, well, clinical efficiency and safety profiling and costs and longevity and all these sorts of things. So let me just throw a couple of things on the table about who's a candidate for recombinant IGF-1 use, and I think from there we can kind of just keep moving forward in a sense. So I just want to show you a couple of slides I put together. These are These are slides that are very generic, but if I could run through this. So what I would say is, look, there are at least 7 different metabolic pathways that we can modulate for hypertrophic effect today. This is 2020. We're not living in 1970 anymore. So, of course, we have the classic genomic, signaling pathway via the androgen receptor, the non-classic signaling via the androgen receptor, the use of anabolic steroids in their anti-catabolic abilities, estrogen receptor-mediated pathways, beta-2 androgenic signaling pathways, the promise of myostatin inhibition, and then, of course, what we're really talking about here today, which is the very big ball of growth hormone, IGF-1, and insulin signaling. Now, so the reason I like to start with this is that I try to explain to people, I'm actually a very big fan of people modulating as many of these pathways as we can, but modulating them in rather moderate ways. So what I mean by that is, traditionally, what guys have done in terms of our tribe is they go straight for number one, which is, the androgen receptor, and they tend to take out a 20-pound sledgehammer and smash on it with a band and sort of thing. And clearly, very, very, very clearly, it produces a result. You can create a hypertrophic outcome by that pathway. But if you think about it just logically and say, well, we have these 7 different pathways available to ourselves, wouldn't it make more sense if we were to moderately modulate each one of them in turn? And the reason I lead with this is a lot of people think that, well, I have to be an IFBB professional, or I have to be an extremely advanced trainer to even consider looking at the growth hormone, IGF, insulin signaling pathway. And I quite honestly completely disagree. So let me explain to you who I think is a candidate for recombinant IGF-1 signaling. And that is basically someone who is obviously an enhanced trainer that is either experiencing the development of antibodies to growth hormone, which is rare, but it does happen. And so they're getting less than ideal consequential return from growth hormone. Or alternatively, there's someone, and this is far more likely, someone that's experiencing insulin sensitivity control issues consequential to growth hormone application. So most people would be familiar that growth hormone and IGF-1, although they act somewhat synergistically to promote hypertrophic outcomes, they act in opposite ways in terms of glucose metabolism. So the reason I show you all this graphic on this slide, this is a client of mine that I'm working with, a guy who's he has his own podcast and things like that. That guy named Joe Jeffrey. He has a following. People might know him. And I've been working with him for a while. We can see, like this is an increase in scale weight. This is an increase in calories consumed. But the most important, visual here is the large graphic with the red bars through it. This is his fasted blood glucose levels over time. So you can see, despite using recombinant human growth hormone, and we're using 3 international units a day here just for reference, we're able to maintain very, very good levels of glucose control with Joe here, okay? So in this situation where someone that's saying, look, I have, I'm leveraging the IGF-1 pathway via the administration of recombinant human growth hormone, but I'm not experiencing insulin sensitivity control issues, I think there's limited application, quite bluntly. But having said that, I'm sure you would appreciate a great many people are not as well managed in terms of glucose control as Joe is. A lot of people have glucose, what just call insulin resistance issues present to them, consequential to their caloric intake, consequential to their behaviors, consequential to their drug pattern. So anytime
risk of that increase the longer you're using growth hormone as well?
It's more dose dependent. So there's very good evidence that we have today that says, look, low level growth hormone use does not contribute to increases in insulin sensitivity. But once you cross a certain threshold, it's kind of like a diminishing return. And then, of course, there's a dose response. The more you use, the worse it gets.
So moderation is key.
Moderation is key. So someone my size, I'm about 100 kilograms on stage, you can control your glucose levels, 2 or 3 IU a day. You don't really have a problem. Joe's, currently at 240 pounds. You can see his glucose control is fabulous. But we're doing this very deliberately and very strategically. This isn't just, that was lucky. It's a pattern. Now, the moment someone presents to me and they've got runaway, insulin resistance issues, I would say, look, you are potentially a candidate to look at the use of IGF-1 because, this is going to actually help us. It becomes a tool we can use so we get the benefits of the systemic and potentially local IGF-1 and all that does, but we're not driving our insulin resistance further and further away from where we want to be in an ideal world. Does all that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, obviously, there's a question down of people that say, look, and I underline this thing that says responsible bodybuilders. I just want to jump forward a couple of slides. I just want to show something here, and that is people need to understand that there is no free ride in our world. There is an inverted J curve, in my opinion, which basically means there's such a thing as too little and there's such a thing as too much of pretty much every hormone that we produce in our body, okay? So anybody that said, look, you can take as many anabolic steroids as you want and there's no consequence, that they need to be beaten down with a drum. This is just not responsible. There is a benefit, in my opinion, to the application of androgens therapeutically and athletically, but there is definitely a level you get to where you start to create toxicity. You start to create problems, many, many, many problems. Hopefully people just go, yeah, hello, fucking Captain Obvious, right? What people don't seem to understand is the same is also true for pretty much every hormone in our body, including IGF-1. And there are many, many, many problems with IGF-1 that the tribe in general don't understand, not the least of which is its impact on the human brain, all right? So anybody that's kind of looking at this and saying, okay, so where are we going so far with this conversation? I guess what I would be saying is this. Look, there are 7 different metabolic pathways that you can modulate for effect. I would rather personally see guys moderately modulating each one of these rather than taking out a 20-pound sledgehammer and smashing away on any one of these, if that makes sense. And that includes the insulin, growth hormone, IGF pathway. So if you look at this and say, right, so there's 7 pathways, that's, at least 7 drugs, if you think about it logically. That kind of gets to the point where you say, well, how many drugs are you going to take if you want to be in this for the long term? Because my message, very, very, very strong message I try to put out to the community is this idea of whatever you do, you need to be mindful of the fact that ideally you're going to be doing this 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years from now. Okay. So that's kind of like my little rant leading into this, just positioning this for people. I have no problem with guys showing interest in the use of recombinant human growth hormone for the modulation of IGF-1 systemically and locally. I think that's very sensible. I do encourage moderate use because there is absolutely unequivocally consequence to overuse of really any drug. It doesn't matter what drug we pull out. There's consequence of overuse. And in my opinion, the obvious candidate for IGF-1 becomes someone who is using growth hormone and is unable to control their insulin resistance consequential to the use of that growth hormone. That would be the starting point, that individual. Okay.
That's actually quite applicable to myself. I have pancreas issues.
Okay.
And so it's not functioning fully. So insulin production is not quite where it should be.
Yep.
Could give me issues with.
Are you using insulin now?
No, I don't use exogenous. I have used it for bulking, but generally I do not.
Okay, cool. All right. So my first caveat here would be I would encourage anybody before they started looking at these drugs is to say, well, where do I fit on that spectrum? Am I even tracking, what my insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance is, and, weekly checking of blood pressure and weekly checking of blood glucose is something that, in my opinion, everybody in that tribe should be just doing by default. So the starting point is that someone steps up and says, look, am I a candidate for, recombinant IGF-1? I would say, let's see your training journals, let's see your biometric markers over the last 3 or 4 months in terms of insulin sensitivity based on what you're currently doing. If they're very good, then there's probably an argument to say you should do that via recombinant human growth hormone. Now, I said, I'm nobody's mother, and I know people are going to say, but I want to use both. And I really don't have a problem with that, as long as people understand that you're in. Let me give you an example. If I said to you, right, I'm going to take your testosterone levels as a natural man and look at the upper limit of that, say, let's just argumentatively say it's 1,000 to 1,100 nanograms per deciliter, okay? And I was going to double that. I don't think that's outrageous. 2,000, 2,200 nanograms per deciliter is not an outrageous amount of androgens for a bodybuilder, you know? But I think 10 times it is just stupid. You know, it's just dumb. It's not required for a start, you know, and I think it's just causing unnecessary stress. So the same argument comes here with IGF-1 levels. So where do you want to place yourself? Do you know? So if you're talking about saying, okay, so I want to double the natural plausible range, okay, that's fine. Do you know? I don't have a problem with that. Do you know? But if you're saying to me, look, I need to take 10 units of growth hormone and I need to take IGF-1 on top of each other, it really can't be described as responsible drug use. You might get away with it for a short period of time, but it's not going to be a sustainable practice. And as long as guys understand the potential consequences long-term, like Alzheimer's disease and dementia and all these sorts of very, very nasty things people don't worry about when they're young, but like, you know, as people like myself get older and older, we are mindful of what we're doing and the consequence of our behavior 10, 20, 30 years from now. I'm currently 53, and I have no intention of stopping anything I'm goddamn doing, but I'm also not going to place my IGF-1 levels at 10 times above normal range. It doesn't make sense to me. Yeah.
I see Joe Jeffrey's blood glucose fasted levels, and it looks like the red line, the average line, is it below 65?
I've just kind of manually drawn that in, so that's not a calculated average. It's just kind of thrown up there. Yeah. So yeah, in this particular circumstances, you know, like that's, you know, very low. Do you know?
Yeah, low. That's lower than most. You rarely see a bodybuilder, even a healthy bodybuilder, have a blood glucose level that low, right?
I agree. So what I would say is, this is where I don't necessarily like blanket recommendations. Everybody should do this. Do you know? You really need to sit down with an individual and look at who they are and what they're doing and their current biomarkers, and then make the strategic decisions about what's the right drug for them. Like I said, like if someone was, you know, significantly higher, if they were battling the high 110s and things like that, I would be much more open to something like in this domain. But for Joe, understanding that this is a drug that potentially can cause you, you know, to go into a hyperglycemic state, this would be a bad idea. Do you know? You look at these levels and say, if we were to introduce a potential hyperglycemic drug here, he could get into trouble here.
Mm-hmm. Mike, how about your blood glucose levels? Do you remember?
Oh, I think fasted is usually not too far off 80.
Yeah, which is very good.
I don't have problems going hypo. Using insulin, I could use quite a bit and have no effects.
Yeah.
No negative.
It's the same thing. As I said, most people, as I said, appreciate that. I'm just a fan of saying, look, we have all of these tools available to us today. Why don't we consider all of them in moderation rather than just smashing them? But that's our history. You know, like if you look at our tribe's history, is to use 2,000 milligrams of androgens and nothing else. Do you know? It doesn't really make sense to do. That's what we do. You know, and I just kind of think, and this is where you'll hear people say, like, you know, you've only been training for a year, you shouldn't be messing around with growth hormone. I completely disagree. I would rather someone be taking, you know, 400, 500 milligrams of androgens and a couple of units of growth hormone and see the synergistic effect between the two than to be pushing up into the 1,000 milligrams range on its own. Like, in other words, let's look at all these metabolic pathways and let's lift them up incrementally. The best analogy I can make would be, if we were building a race car, we would potentially improve the braking and the steering and the cooling and the suspension and the engine all at once. Doing slowly, you lift them up. You don't, buy a $500 piece of shit Toyota Crown and stick a 1,000 horsepower V8 under the bonnet and don't fix the brakes. That's a recipe for fucking disaster.
Like, my friends, Victor.
Yeah, this is the tribe. This is the way most people. So we're getting into this point. So firstly, who would be a candidate? Honestly, someone that felt that they had developed a degree of growth hormone antibody or resistance to growth hormone. As I said, it does happen. It's documented in the evidence. It's not common, but it does happen. So if someone felt that they had done everything right and they weren't seeing a response to growth hormone, sure, no problem. Or someone that was having an insulin sensitivity issue. And then really the question starts to get, more into what you were asking about. So if we decide to, open that box and talk about, recombinant IGF-1, what variant would we put our hand out for? What would we reach for? Okay. So I don't know if you know very much about the different variants and why they were developed and how they've been researched. Do you know much about that? Should we talk
a little bit, but I mean not extensive knowledge.
Okay, cool. All right, so do you have any questions at that point, Tony?
No.
Okay, cool.
I mean when we use growth hormone and IGF in our blasts, we're getting some IGF from the conversion of growth hormone, insulin, estrogen. We're using IGF LR3 usually.
Yep.
And I first started experimenting with IGF-DES a long time ago. So his interest now is mostly in the IGF. That's DES. That's what he's fascinated by. And I've become a fan of LR3.
Okay.
So I'm trying to circle my head back around the reason to use DES over LR3 is what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Well, actually, maybe I should say what my true goal is before we get too far into this. I mean, I'm looking to almost like a site enhancement. Like LR3 goes through your whole body, so everything's growing at the same rate. But if I can do more site specific and say bring up upper chest, bring out shoulders specifically,
okay.
I'd really like to accomplish that to get a more aesthetic look.
Okay. We can certainly let's talk about that when we get to that, because we're not far off that. Let's have a look at that, because there's some. The challenge is always trying to balance the clinical evidence versus anecdotal observation. And very often people who follow anecdote don't have fabulous means of documenting their behaviors and documenting outcomes. It's, I feel, the classic one is I get a lot of guys that come to me with things like sexual dysfunction issues and things like that. And when you get down to it, they're not really experiencing sexual dysfunction issues at all. They were just, when they were using very high anabolics, they wanted to have sex if the wind blew, and now they have the normal sex drive of a normal man. You understand what I mean? So there's a lot of anecdote, there's a lot of observations, a lot of commentary from people, and they say like this idea of like sexual dysfunction is like, if I only want to have sex once a day, that means I have sexual dysfunction. I'm not sure where that comes from, but I get all sorts of very strange things. Let's talk about variants of IGF-1. So firstly, as I said, the greatest challenge to me in this process is that in our community, people tend to make decisions about alternatives, if you put different alternatives on the table, based on what is presented as the strongest option. Okay, yeah. This is kind of true even if we talk about anabolic steroids. And people will say, well, such and such an anabolic steroid is stronger than this other steroid, and the reality is we have no evidence to say that's true at all. I'll give you an example. I'm hoping that most people by now would say, look, this idea that you need to take 1,000 milligrams of testosterone to have an equal potency of anabolic outcome as you do for 300 mil of Anavar is just bullshit. Yes, Anavar may well have an anabolic rating 3 times greater than testosterone, but that's in a mouse model. That's in a rodent model. It doesn't apply to human beings. No one is going to convince me that you could take 300 milligrams of Anavar and you need to take 1,000 milligrams of testosterone to get the same result. That's just not true. It's just not true. This idea that Trenbolone is 5 times more anabolic than in testosterone, it's not true. Try taking 300 milligrams of testosterone and 300 milligrams of Trenbolone and tell me you grew 5 times faster. You fucking don't. It's just, it makes no sense. But that's how guys choose anabolic steroids on what happened in a rat model. That means Anavar is 3 times more powerful than testosterone. I need to use Anavar rather than testosterone as a growth promoter. So my point being is that the way that we make decisions about the selection of compounds is horribly flawed. And it begins, as I said, with this idea that what we see in rat models, we're going to see in human beings. Okay. And layered on top of this idea that, give me the strongest version that you've got without looking at the potential consequence of what that means. So in my opinion, when you look at these variants, you should be asking the following questions. What are the differences in the mechanistic action of these variants? And I will explain what they are in a minute. Yeah. So what quality data do we have to support the use of the different variants? Is it mechanistic? Is it surrogate-based? Is it human use-based? Our tribe's personal experience, cost, availability, risk profile. There's a series of questions that you have to ask before you start choosing variant. Not simply, my mate said it's really good. Now, the great, I guess, equivalency here, if we look at this, I'm going to come back to that slide, is insulin. Okay. So I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that there are many different variants of insulin, and you will find people out there that will swear black and blue by Humalog or this variant or that variant, right? But there's very, very little evidence to suggest that the difference in actual anabolic potential that is, you know, in evidence, in anecdote, it actually exists in clinical data. You know, yes, you could pull out, you know, studies on Lantus and look at, you know, how Lantus's binding affinity with the receptor, and it's much stronger than the other things, and it hangs around longer. But I'm going to be honest with you. I have never found anyone that said, look, you know, when you really get down to it, because Lantus is in the bloodstream longer, you know, or a rapid acting insulin is in and out faster, that you're going to grow at a rate that you can actually put your finger on and say, you should use that analog every time, all the time. It becomes very personal, do you know? And one of the challenges with, you know, recombinant IGF-1 is it's exactly like analog. These are analog variants designed to do very small different things. But I don't know what your thoughts are on insulin, but I cannot honestly say that that version of insulin is a must-do because it's better than that version. It hangs around longer, it gets in faster, it binds to the receptor more. You're going to grow twice as big. I don't know whether you've ever experienced that, but I've never experienced this.
No, I've never used Lantus. I've only ever used rapid or fast insulin. Humalog.
So you understand there are many different variants, however. That's the point I'm making, right? And yeah. I don't think it's reasonable or rational to say that this variant over that variant is the right choice every time for every person.
Right.
Does that make sense? Yes, there is a case to be made that that person should use that person should use that, but it's very difficult to say everybody should use Lantus because you grow bigger. Why? Because it hangs around longer. Or everyone should use rapid because it gets in there and it has a greater, you know, potential power profile over this sort of time frame. It's just not what you see in observation. And sadly, if you've been around long enough, you remember, like, there was a point when growth hormone was the fucking game changer. Everybody was using growth hormone. You know, just the name was powerful, right? And then it became insulin, and then it became, you know, and it's almost like IGF-1 is the latest derivation of this thing. It's the game changer. It's going to change everything, and you have to use this variant. But history shows that as we go through these things, there is no evidence in human beings that any particular variant of the testosterone deliver a testosterone molecule lets you grow tissue at 3 or 4 times the rate.
Yeah. So this theory makes sense to me with testosterone, where even a testosterone suspension, let's say, lasts 8 hours, and a testosterone enanthate is a couple weeks. It's not that big of a difference compared, but and with insulin, even an insulin that lasts 24 hours versus 6 hours, not that big of a difference compared to here we have IGF-DES 30 minutes, IGF-LR3 24 hours. That's a massive difference in the amount of time it's active.
So let me see if I can find a couple of things here, because we'll go through them. Here we go. So this is the half-time of IGF-DES, right? So if I just read this to you, by contrast, IGF-DES had a half-life of 2.2 minutes. The difference is like, so IGF-1 was 5 minutes and IGF-DES was 2.2 minutes. And
then LR3
is significantly longer. You're saying, like, the difference, like, so 2.5 minutes and 5 minutes, like, oh my God, it's going to change everything.
Right.
Do you mean?
Right. So the difference between our natural IGF and IGF-DES is pretty similar as far as the.
Well, no, it's half, and there's absolutely. Let's go through and look at some of the evidence, because there's absolutely very interesting points of evidence that we should look at. So what this graphic here on the right-hand side represents is basically the dose response for the 3 different analogs: IGF-1, DES and LR3 given to rodents, and they're measuring the change in body weight over a time frame based on what we call greater doses of the drug. Do you understand what that means? Yeah? Does that make sense? Yep.
Yeah.
So you can see here in a rodent model, we saw significant changes in body weight based on the two variants. This is absolutely true. In a rodent model, we see this. Now, if we were to basically ask for a little bit more information, this is the latest unbound bioavailable IGF-1 enhancer somatic growth study. It was done, I think, in 2011, which is quite old now, right? And you can see here, one of the challenges is that these compounds don't just grow the muscle tissue in these rodents, they grow everything, all of the organs, the size of the thing. So when they say we injected this compound and we saw significantly larger growth weights, body weight from the rodents, right? You have to understand, but that's not muscle, that's the whole rodent, okay? So when you look at the control here for muscle, and admittedly they only looked at one muscle, which is the quadricep muscle, this is the control, the size of the muscle actually declined in weight on the administration of these two analogs. So all of the increases in body weight that are referenced in the literature, it's not muscle tissue. So again, people need to be very careful when they read the literature. So they go, so hang on a sec. So here's the very first study that was done. This is 2008, and I'll just read this to you. I apologize, but I'm going to read it word for word. Our objective was to define the relationship between tumor uptake, between IGF-1 and I think that's the, oh, sorry, that's the wrong study. I'm not looking for that one. Let me find the correct one. This one here. Okay. Is that the one? Yes, there we go. Okay. All right, so basically this is looking at DES, and it says DES is a truncated variant of IGF-1, blah, blah, blah. And it says here, the increased potency is retained in part when the variant is administered with selective anabolic effects, particularly evident in the gut tissues. Clinical opportunities for DES have not yet been evaluated, but could apply in catabolic state as well as for the treatment of inflammatory bowel diseases. Now, I don't want people to read too much into these studies, but the point I'm just trying to make is simply when you see studies like this and people say this drug is, you know, significantly more potent because it massively changed the scale weight of the, or the change of body weight in rodent studies, that's absolutely true, 100% true. You can see here, as they, you know, raised the greater dose of the drug, we saw a significantly greater response in body weight change based on those variants. But body weight doesn't directly equate to tissue. And you can see when we start to break down the tissues, you go, so the muscle went backwards and all the organs started growing.
Well, but I mean, these rats are also not going to the gym, are they?
Correct, 100%. And the most important takeaway from this, and this is perfect you say that, because the most important takeaway from this is this, and that is, we don't have any human clinical evidence here at all. This is a drug that we have some fragments of interesting information that hold tremendous promise for future research, right? And I think they should, you know, that these threads need to be continue to be pulled on. But it's not like we have, you know, like groups of individuals where we're administered these drugs and looked at them in human beings and seen a response. Right. Do you know what I mean? So you therefore have to place this class of drug into the research chemical basket. It has to be defined that way. There's no human evidence here, period. None. Not a single study on human beings, right? So this is, you know, where I'll loop back to my biggest point here, and that is this. I believe if you are interested in the long-term use of performance-enhancing drugs, and I mean by that 20, 30, 40 years of exposure, your strategy should fundamentally be this. You should, for the most part, stick with the drugs that are approved for human use, and we have an abundance of evidence to support their safe and effective use, right? So when it comes to anabolic steroids, these are one of the most studied drugs in all pharmacology. Almost no drug has had as many studies done as testosterone. You're in thousands of things we could talk about. And all the various, you know, derivations of testosterone, we have an abundance of clinical information to look at, the good, the bad, the ugly. That doesn't mean it's always good news. It means we can tell you with a high degree of confidence, do this and this happens, Okay. So when you want to modulate the insulin IGF pathway, do we choose a drug that is in human clinical use and we have fabulous data to talk about? You do this and this happens, or do you choose a drug that's never been used in human beings? Right? To me, this is a no-brainer. This is, you choose the drug that is approved for human use, right? And we have great clinical evidence to talk about. So is insulin a drug that we can support with fabulous data? Absolutely. We could talk all day about rapid acting insulin and long acting insulins. We could do the same thing about growth hormone. We could do the same thing about beta-2 androgenic agonists. We can talk about all of these drugs. And then over here, you have a drug that's never, ever, ever, ever been put into a human being. And people then want to say, oh, tell me the safe way to use this drug. And the truth is that we just don't know. I'm not sitting here telling anyone, oh my God, this is going to happen. The truth is we don't know. And if anybody is naive enough to think that every single drug that is developed by pharmacology as a potential drug candidate comes out the other side of profile testing as getting a green tick, it's not. It doesn't work that way. Most drug candidates basically fail the process because something comes up at some point that means that they're withdrawn from practice. So let me just restate where I'm going with this. In my opinion, you should take all of these drugs and put them into two piles. In the first pile, we're going to call these basal or daily use PEDs. These are drugs that you're going to live with for the next 20 years. They're going to become firm friends. And in that basket is recombinant human growth hormone, insulin, and anabolic steroids, and, right? And then there's a pile of drugs over here I call situational experimental use. And I have no problem with anybody wanting to put their hands into that basket and explore what's in that for them, as long as they understand that we don't have any evidence that it's safe to do so, nor that they're going to produce, in better outcome than what's in the approved for human use basket. And so you have to make this decision about which is the right decision for you. And what I would say is, if you are risk adverse, you should just stay in your lane. Stay in the lane that says, look, I can explain to you what happens when you take 3 units of growth hormone all day long. Here's all the studies, right? And then we have a study, and it's very well and easy to say, well, it's only a small change, into the molecular structure of this compound. But you have to understand it's only a small change. The difference between, trenbolone and nandrolone is only a small change, but they're vastly different drugs with vastly different risk profiles. Nandrolone is probably one of the one of the more benign drugs we have, and trenbolone is plausibly one of the more controversial drugs that we have. But they're from the same family of drugs, relatively small molecular changes. So my point to you would be, if you wanted to do, Des, then by all means, as long as you are well enough informed to say this is a relatively high risk strategy, we don't know is the answer. So you can go to all the guys in the gym and tap them on the shoulder, which in my opinion, none of them have any idea what they're fucking doing. Not being disrespectful. They like I always say, look, if you want to be a professional bodybuilder, you probably don't want to know too much because it's like, maybe you don't want to do that, right? You could tap them on the shoulder and say, have you ever used this drug? And they could say, yes, I have used it. I've got great effect from it. I did this, but we don't really know any more than that anecdotal observation. It's very much like living in the 1970s, walking up to someone talking about steroid use. We don't know. We didn't understand the impact on cardiac remodeling. We didn't understand the impact on kidney disease. We didn't understand the impact on the brain and the function of androgens back then. We had no idea. Everybody was worried about their hair and gynecomastia and fucking their prostate. We now know that prostate is not a problem. There's the androgen saturation theory has put that to bed. We now know that the liver is the least of our problems, and what you should be worried about is your heart and your brain and your kidneys. We now know that. But if you had asked someone in the 70s, they didn't even understand that. And that's literally where you're standing at the moment, in the 70s, in the dark, talking to people that have tried these drugs and offering their anecdotal observation, which is fine, which is great value, but you don't really know. So my suggestion to you would be is, if you want to open that basket, I would basically say, look, lots and lots and lots of people have experimented with that. There's not great data to say, is it a long-term safe strategy? If you wanted to try it, I've tried it. By all means, try it. I'll be honest with you, though, perhaps because of the elevation of IGF levels that I was prepared to tolerate, which is modest, I didn't see anything to say, oh my God, this changes everything.
Right.
You know? And I'll be honest with you, I don't know that you should necessarily be fucking around with drugs unless that's the response. In other words, I'll give you an example. There are two drugs on the market at the moment that are PPAR agonists. One is telmisartan and one is GW-1516. Okay. So on one level, we have an ARB/PPAR agonist that is approved for human use and passed every single trial that needs to be in human use, okay, that I can go into my pharmacy and purchase over the counter here in Thailand. And the other level, we have a competitive drug which failed every single dosage testing that it needed to pass to get into marketplace. Like that, now that doesn't mean that GW-1516 is going to cause cancer. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is, in order for these drugs to reach marketplace, they have to pass certain standardized toxicity testing. It's a requirement, okay? And that particular drug didn't pass the testing, so the developers abandoned it. So my question would be, well, why wouldn't you just use the PPAR agonist that has been approved for human use and in human use for 60 years that does the same thing? You see where I'm going with that loop? So if you can get the outcome you need from recombinant human growth hormone, why would you use a research chemical? In my opinion, the only reason you put your hand in the research basket is because what's on offer in there is not on offer in the human use basket.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense? Yeah. And there are going to be occasions when that is the situation where you go, look, when I look down my list of approved for human use drugs that I can support clinically with quality evidence, here's a drug that's not, there's no direct competition. There's no direct line that I can draw between the two. So if I want to explore that, I only have one choice, and that is to open up that basket. Okay. I don't know whether that completely changes the discussion, but for most people, they go, yeah, I get what you're saying is, if you're using 10 units of growth hormone a day and you're saying, well, I'm going to use IGF-1 and I'm doing it for commercial reasons, well, that's a valid reason, Doreen, but that's a different reason again, and that's not something that you said. You know what I'm saying?
Well,
like
yeah, like 10 units of HGH a day would be quite expensive for me at the moment.
Absolutely, it's beyond my financial means to do so. Nor would I do it anyway. But let's say I was motivated to do it. I literally couldn't afford to do it on a sustainable level.
Yeah. Yeah,
So that's what I would say. I would say, look, if you're going to do it, then one, understand that you should still take recombinant human growth hormone because of the binding protein discussion. Do you understand what that means?
No.
Okay. So the reason that these drugs basically have different pharmacokinetics profiles is that they don't bind to IGF-1 binding proteins. Okay, a binding protein, you could see. Let me just roll this up. You can see what this means. A binding protein is fundamentally akin to what sex hormone binding globulin is to testosterone. Yeah, a lot of people think that sex hormone binding globulin grabs hold of your bioavailable free testosterone, won't let it go, and it makes it inert. And they are true, but what they don't understand is that there's a biological function at play there where it's basically releasing androgens in a controlled fashion. It does stuff. Okay, so in my opinion, if you're going to use these compounds, you should basically use a little growth hormone and get the IGF-1 consequential to that, and then have the variant that is not basically able to bind to the binding proteins present as well.
Could that be accomplished with something like MK677? Or is that opening a whole new basket?
Plausibly, yes, but again, that's one of these drugs where if you study the literature, I don't know necessarily that stimulating the ghrelin axis is a long-term viable strategy. I actually think things like growth hormone releasing peptides and secretagogues and that have a place, but really what they are is for when you stop using growth hormone, use them as like a PTC. You know? Get your system to stimulate the natural production of kind of growth hormone. So if you've been using, like me, I've been using recombinant human growth hormone for many years. I haven't come off for a very, very, very long time. And let's say my financial circumstances were to change, or whatever my circumstances were to change, and I needed to come off, I would use compounds like that as part of a post-cycle therapy for growth hormone strategy.
Gotcha.
But I wouldn't be trying to drive them into super physiological range. Okay. I think secretagogues do a great job of what they're designed to do, and that is basically to assist in the production of these hormones within physiological range. Okay. But ultimately, you're wanting to drive them outside of that boundary.
Right. Okay. So,
Yeah. So I don't see them as a solution. So I guess if I was trying to summarize, I apologize. It's become a little bit disjointed because it's not the conversation that you potentially want to have. What I would say is, I think you should have an insulin strategy, and we could talk about insulin a little bit if you want, an insulin strategy, an anabolic steroid strategy, a anti-catabolic drug strategy, something that works on the beta-2 receptors. Like, in other words, I showed you that graphic before that had the 7 different metabolic pathways. I think you should set up a strategy that just moderately modulates each one of those pathways. And the final caveat I would put on top of that is for a reason, and this is the reason. If you look at the studies where they co-administered recombinant human growth hormone with recombinant IGF-1 in healthy individuals, despite the fact that they saw elevated IGF-1 levels, systemic elevated IGF-1 levels, right? They didn't register an increase in protein synthesis. Now, there's a reason for that. If you think about it, okay, let's say we talk about fat loss drugs, and you go, okay, so there's 10 different classes of fat loss drugs that you could potentially put on the table, right? From chemical uncouplers like DNP to growth hormone itself to and, right? Okay. I'm sure logically you would go, okay, so I could potentially access all of these fat loss agents. But there is a limit to when you start to use them to how much fat loss you're going to get before it just doesn't work anymore. Like, there's a diminishing return. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say you were able to lose 2 pounds of fat a week without any pharmacological assistance at all, and you started using fat burners, and you could take that from 2 pounds a week to 5 pounds a week. I don't think that's outrageous. Okay. But if you keep putting more and more and more on the table, it doesn't become 20 pounds a week and 30 pounds a week of fat loss. Do you know what I mean? And so the same thing is true if you flip the whole discussion over and start talking about growth promoters. If you're using 7 or 8 different growth promoters, touching on each of these 8 metabolic pathways relatively moderately, trying to keep our stress levels low, more and more and more of these drugs doesn't mean you grow faster and faster and faster. You can only lay down protein accretion at a certain rate. Okay, so many pounds per month. Do you know what I mean? So I just want to show you a couple of things, and I do this mostly for the audience, not yourself, right? A lot of people in this market today are interested in what we call rapid growth programs. So there's nothing new about rapid growth programs. They've been going on since the 1970s. If you look at this image here, I promise you, Arnold Schwarzenegger never put fucking 2 inches on his arms in 7 weeks in his fucking life. It's just a bald-faced lie. If you know the Colorado experiment, you know where Arthur Jones put Quesaviata. But basically what they did was they detrained an individual, you know, put them in the worst possible situation, then they put them in the best possible situation and said, look what we achieved in so many days. Okay. So I just want to show this because, as I said, the community as a whole needs to get this message. This is what longevity looks like in the real world. This is, there's no better example of what I try to preach than basically this man, Dexter Jackson, right? So this is him at 148 pounds in 1998 on the stage, and 100 pounds different in stage weight, you know, over 22 years, okay? Now, admittedly, right, you know, he got the bulk of that return in that 10-year time frame, okay? But people are obsessed with this idea that, you know, if I take these drugs, I'm going to grow this fast. I'm going to put, you know, 20 pounds on in so many days. The reality is this: when I work with clients, I try to get them to do something akin to this. This is a good example of first exposure anabolic steroids. So this is 14 months work from natural on the left-hand side to enhanced on the right-hand side. And this is 15 pounds over a 14-month time frame. I ask people to look at this and go, man, what a fucking year that was. Yeah. Right? But people are trying to get 15 pounds in 15 fucking days. Right?
This isn't my goal.
No, I understand that, but you understand. So if you take it slowly, right, you don't need more than a little IGF-1. Do you know what I mean? And you can probably get that from recombinant human growth hormone, safe in the understanding that this is not going to be causing me problems down the road, like dementia issues and all these problems that we know are coming to a whole generation of drug users. They're coming down the track. Right? So the point being is, I know people don't want to hear this message. This is, I'm embarrassed putting myself on the same page as fucking Dexter Jackson, but I have probably put on 50 pounds of scale weight, and I mean stage weight, over 35 years of training. I'm not particularly genetically blessed, and I use mind-bogglingly small amount of drugs, right? But, and this is what people need to understand, is I am interested in being able to do this at 60, 70, 80 years old. I completely agree. If you want to put on 50 pounds in a year, that's going to be trouble. But, and this is the final slide I'll show you. I don't know whether you know this guy. This is a guy called Keon Pearson. He kind of made a big break recently. This is what 25 pounds in 1 year looks like. It took him a whole year to put 25 pounds on. Now, anybody out there that thinks that they can do 25 pounds in a month is fucking dreaming. That's a year's work with one of the most genetically gifted men in the world today.
Yeah,
so
it's still a really big year.
It's unbelievable. It's not, this is the frustration that I have. That is unfucking believable. That's 2 pounds a month, all right? This is about 1 pound a month, give or take. And the great irony, of course, is when I say to people, do you really believe that you need untested research chemicals to realize a 1 pound of lean muscle gain a month? You don't. If you look at those 7 metabolic pathways and you modulate them all, I'm not saying don't use drugs, I'm saying this, go for it. Look at those ones, right? Nobody can convince me that you cannot put on a pound of tissue a month. But what everybody wants is they want 15 pounds in 15 days. And that's where they start to get into trouble, because they can't do it. It's not possible to do it. Even a guy like Keon can't do it, right? It's a fantasy fed to them by Arnold Schwarzenegger in fucking the Colorado experiment, things like that, right? No, you didn't put 2 inches on your arms, Arnold, bullshit, right? And so these marketing exercises lead people to taking what I call unnecessary risk, which is, so I'm using drugs that are not approved for human use, that have never been tested in a human being. Why am I doing that? Because I'm chasing an unrealistic, unattainable goal. And if you back down 2 notches and you look at this and go, this guy never, ever used any research chemicals at all. There's no oral steroids. There's no methylated orals here. There's nothing like that. Now, I'm not saying that's the best return that's ever been done in a year, but anybody out there should look at that and go, man, if I could do that, I would be stoked.
Yeah, it's good progress.
It's good progress, and you don't need to take high risk to do that. You don't need to be using drugs that have never been tested in a human being to do that. So this is where people need to start to think, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, why can't I just live within a list of drugs, testosterone and all of its analogs, insulin and all of its analogs, recombinant human growth hormone and all of its analogs, the PPAR agonist telmisartan, injectable L-carnitine, and you go down the list, some buffers, some, catalysts. And that. Why can't I live within that list and realize this goal? You absolutely 100% can. Absolutely can be done. So, not trying to
want to.
Yeah, correct. So here's the challenge, I suppose, for you as a experienced trainer, and that's going, why are you putting in the hand in the research chemical basket? And as I said to you, if the answer is because what I want is not on offer in the human drug use basket, I fully support that. 100%. Great. Do it. But very often it's because people just don't know any better.
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's anecdotal evidence, like you said, people telling little wives' tales and legends in the gym.
That's because people believe that's what it takes. It takes 10 years to go from there to there. It doesn't take 10 months, right? And you hear people saying, I put on 30 pounds in a steroid cycle. I'm saying, so you're telling me you put on 1/3 of that in a single cycle, but it took him 10 years to get there. That's ridiculous. They read this shit. This is just shit, basically. And it's been going on since the 1970s. And they believe, well, I'm not realizing those sorts of returns from these drugs, I'm only getting a pound a month, so I have to raise my risk profile. But a pound a month is a good year. Ask any professional bodybuilder, 15 pounds of legitimate stage tissue in a year is a fabulous year, guys. It's a fabulous year. It's not to be ashamed of. It's not, what am I doing wrong? It's a fabulous year. 15 pounds is a fabulous year. If, when you look at it, you go, you know what? I didn't take any risk here. I stuck with drugs that are known quantities. I got blood work regularly. I didn't let my blood pressure get out of control. I managed my blood glucose levels. I did this, I did this, I did this. 15 pounds is a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous year.
Well, but what about, say, just recently, I did a little experiment with IGF-1 LR3, and we did use growth hormone with it as well, and insulin. And I do have significant scale weight increase after just a short blast. And it stuck around. I leaned out because I did put on a little extra fluff and water, as you do with that kind of thing, in the short time. And I've leaned down, and I'm right where I was before doing it, and I weigh more. So
okay, so
where does that come into play?
I'm not going to dispute that's not possible. Let me ask you guys a couple of questions. How long have you been training, Mike?
Well, training period, or training with any kind of structure?
No, training with structure. Training with structure. With
structure, I'd say probably only a year or two.
Okay, great. Well, you've come a very, very, very long way. How long just casually training?
Oh, since I was 16, so like.
How old are you now?
41.
Okay, cool. So it's fair to say more than 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
and if you were to lean down now and jump on a stage, what do you think you would weigh?
Oh, significantly less than I do now, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'm just trying to get a sense of it. I'll tell you what I'm trying to get a sense of, and then maybe you can just directly answer the question. I'm interested in that 20-year time frame. How many pounds of muscle have you put on every year?
That'd be really tough to gauge. We'll go over the last 10 years because that'd be probably the most consistent.
Sure.
I'd probably put on 180, about 220 now. Over that's about 40 pounds of weight walking around of muscle, maybe half of that.
Yep.
Maybe.
So about 20 pounds of actual tissue over 10 years.
Yeah, and most of that's not really structured training.
So you see what I'm saying? Like, that's 2 pounds a year.
Yeah.
Right. Just what I'm saying is, like, you see these guys that are saying, like, I want to put on 20 pounds of tissue in 2 months. I'm kind of like, but hang on a sec. You put on 2 pounds a year. How about we just say this? Your history says I put on 2 pounds a year for the last 10 years. How about we just do this? How about we put on 15 pounds this year? From this point forward to the next year, we put on 6 times or 7 times your best year ever.
Yeah.
Doing? Why are you chasing? I'm not saying you are. I'm talking to the community. Why is everyone constantly chasing these unachievable goals when you simply say, I'm telling you, if you start naturally training and you did 15 pounds in your first year and 10 pounds in your second year and 6 or 7 pounds in your third year, that's a good start. And then you start using drugs and you did the same 15 pounds, 10 pounds, 8 pounds, you look like a bodybuilder.
Yeah.
Doing? And you after 3 years of drugs, you don't need to be into experimental research chemicals, anabolic steroids, growth hormone, insulin, these things. That's more than enough if you eat right and train hard, right? The challenge is people don't want to accept that when you look at a guy and you go, man, I really like that guy's physique, and you tap him on the shoulder and say, how long have you been training seriously? He's going to say it took me 5 or 6 years to get here. People want to hear 5 or 6 months, and this is why people are always looking for these tools. So my honest suggestion to you, I'm not your mother, you do what you want to do. I would be saying, look, rather than looking at this protocol that you're talking about now, my guidance to you would be this. Let's set up a training program for the next 12 months, the goal of which is that you add 1 pound of lean tissue every month. So at the end of the year, you have put on 12 pounds of tissue, and you don't use any experimental drugs. You stick with human approved drugs. I will give you your money back if I can't get that for you. You see what I'm saying? So why would you take on the risk, the unknown, when you don't need to? It doesn't make any sense, because like you just think about it rationally, logically. Why take on risk in life in anything that's not required?
Fair enough.
That's not required. I guess you're faced with two pathways here. Either you stick to the course, and this is why I call these consulting calls, right? I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just giving you my opinion. Either you stick to your course, which is fine, right? And you choose to use these variants that we have very little clinical data in, and we only have anecdotal observation. And my suggestion to you would be somewhere between 40 and 100 micrograms a day. Again, but this is just based on anecdotal feedback from what people say, right? There's no evidence that you can offer to do that, right? So there's that pathway, or you just stick with the 4 units of recombinant human growth hormone and create the IGF-1 levels systemically and locally from that, but with a lower risk profile attached to it. These are the two pathways that are in front of you.
I found a picture of Mike after let's see if we can show, of the transformations.
Oh, awesome.
So he's over there and over here. Oh. So he gets pretty conditioned. Yeah. But he does want to get to stage conditioning sometime and lose the last bit of baby fat. So he wanted to do bulk up his weak. Well, they're not weak actually. They're strong body parts. Make his strong body parts even more extreme, and then shred down the competition style.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons like I mentioned before, I'm looking at the DES is because. As we know, everything kind of grows together. But if I can sort of shortcut in and try and bring up certain lagging parts just for aesthetic purposes, just for my own peace of mind.
Yep. So let's take the situation where he's sort of plateaued certain muscle groups. Like he's gained as much body weight as he wants, but there's just certain muscles he wants to prioritize.
Yep.
Then IGF-DES for that purpose. What do you think?
I would say a systemic approach rather than just a drug approach. That's what I'm saying. I talk a lot about pharmacology, but I like this. I'll give you a classic example. I have a program called the Victor Black Death Program. Okay. And specifically, it's a program that's designed to bring up lagging body parts. Okay. So people come and go, I want to bring my legs up. I want to bring my back up. I want to bring my arms, my shoulders up, sort of thing. So I'll just explain in a nutshell how it works, because in really short order. The average person is capable of doing somewhere between 80 and 100 hard-working sets a week. Right? That's about our recovery capacity. Now, you can see lower than that, you can see higher than that. There's lots of things that affect that: age, sex, other things you have going in your life, career, kids, wife, blah, 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 blah. But somewhere between 80 and 100 working sets a week. Right? So the average person is doing something like, let's say, a body part a day, or they're doing push-pull legs, right? If you do push-pull legs, you are basically, by definition, allocating 1/3 of your training volume to your legs, okay? If you're doing a body part a day, you're basically, by definition, allocating 20% of your body part to legs, okay? So the way the Black Death program basically works is very, very simple. It couldn't be more obvious. It's saying, okay, so let's take your strongest body parts and apply minimum effective volume to those body parts, enough volume so you don't lose any ground, but not enough volume to create a hypertrophic stimulus great enough to produce tissue growth, and redirect all of that volume to the body part that you want to grow, right? And then what we can do is, on top of that, talk about a localized drug strategy, where we would potentially be injecting into those muscle tissues. But again, just using the drug and not changing your training paradigm, I don't think makes any sense. You'd be saying, okay, so
this was part of it as well. Like currently, I'll do legs, like Monday through Saturday. It's legs, back and chest, arms and shoulders, legs, back and chest, arms and shoulders, day off.
Great.
I do kind of like a Dorian Yates approach with one working set in the back off, warming up, of course, getting to it. You're familiar, I'm sure.
Sure.
And it's actually been very, very effective. I feel like when I stay out of the gym, obviously you lose that little bit of hypertrophy where you're feeling swollen, but the general mass has stuck around quite well with the strength training, the hard sets, and I'm actually really enjoying it.
Yep.
Because I am seeing the progress, but I'm not, try as I may, I'm not seeing the progress exactly where I want to be seeing it. And I don't know if that's my genetic lagging, or my muscle insertions are just poor in certain areas. But.
So I think what you just described is a variant of what I'm talking about. It's very close, but let's extend that and go, okay, so imagine if you did this and you said, okay, so Mondays is leg day and Tuesdays is back and biceps and Wednesdays is leg day and Thursdays is chest and triceps, and Friday is leg day, right? And you're going, holy crap, how many fucking sets of legs I'm doing? Yeah, you're probably doing fucking 40 or 50 sets of legs a week. That's a ridiculous amount of volume for legs. Yeah. Completely unsustainable. It doesn't work except for one thing, and that is we're taking our total 100 hardworking sets a week, directing 50 of them to legs and directing 50 of them to everything else. We haven't increased our total systemic work output, okay? So we said, okay, we're going to stay within our total systemic capacity to do work, but we're going to redirect our work volume to the body part that we want to grow in a massively biased fashion for a very short period of time, let's say 4 weeks, okay? So we've got 80 sets, 85 sets, 90 sets, 95 sets, 100 sets. Like this is our progression model over a 5-week time frame, yeah? And in the same process of that, we would be using drugs like insulin on training days and, you know, IGF-1, you know, localized administration, that sort of stuff, all those sorts of things. I said, but that to me then becomes a total system that you would use in the short term to fix a problem rather than a long-term training model.
This is what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
I want to go back to a long-term healthy plan.
Correct. So what I would say is, and again, it goes back to that point of, so when I said there's 2 baskets of drugs, this is exactly what situational use drugs are for. So I'll give you an example. I love the drug Anadrol. I think it's a fabulous drug, but it's also a known carcinogen, right? It just like GW, it failed its carcinogenic testing studies. It failed. It shouldn't be on the market, right? So the reality is that would I use Anadrol as a default drug? No, I don't think it belongs in our daily or basal use. But in that circumstances where you said, look, I'm going to set a 5-week block of time aside where I'm going to expose myself to situational use drugs, maybe a little higher risk here, and volume that is completely unsustainable over a multi-year time frame sort of thing, then I support that, because what you're doing is saying, well, I'm going to expose myself to these compounds in a relatively limited manner. It's 5 weeks of exposure to the drugs. That's not how most people see it. You see what I'm saying? There's a difference between the two. So if you said to me, listen, can you set me up between now and Christmas time with a 5-week program that I'm prepared to adopt a higher risk model because I want this return, become the new year, I'm off for that. That I support 100%. That's how I use research chemicals. I use them acutely to get an outcome that I can't get from the other drugs, but then I wouldn't continue that into January, February, March, as most people do. And that applies to methylated orals, that applies to any research chemical. It's all about saying, okay, so what do you really want and what risk profile are you prepared to adopt? And if someone said to me, look, I'm prepared to turn my risk profile up for a short period of time, let's just arguably say 3 months to achieve this outcome, I fully support that. I have no problem with that. What I don't see though is that dialogue. I don't see that conversation. I see people using these drugs over and over and over and over again, completely oblivious to the fact that that's a high risk model. And you need to use it, the best words I can say is, in a situational capacity.
Right. Yeah. No, I fully agree. And that is exactly what I'm looking at.
That I fully support. So let me see if I can give you a takeaway then from the call today that is of value to you. Yeah. What I would say is you should probably set up a training model that says, lean yourself down a little bit. You look very lean now. Set up a 5 to 6 week training model that basically pyramids the drugs up. Okay, don't go straight up to high level. Typically all that does is raise myostat and kind of blunts growth straight away. So there's a ramping up of training volume from 80 to 100 hardworking sets a week. You may even overreach into 120 hardworking sets in the final week before a deload.
Just for the specific muscle group.
Just for this specific muscle group, yeah? And then potentially what you would do is you raise your training volume, you raise your food intake, and you raise your drugs using drugs from the situational use basket in that paradigm for that time block, and then put them away for the next 12 months. You mean happy with the result you got, saying, okay, so I was seeking this outcome. I realized that outcome. I walk away very happy with that return. It's just not falling into the mindset of, that whether people like to accept it or not, these drugs are very, very, very psychologically addictive, right? So you do this and it worked. It's very easy to stumble into this position, and I'm going to continue to use it and continue to use it and continue to use it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I would say if you want help with that, I'm more than happy to help you put together something and we can document it and you can test it and see what outcome you get, sort of thing. But yeah, it's basically saying 5 or 6 weeks, training volume increase, food volume increase on the body part, and the drugs basically go up. And in that process, let's open that situational use basket, put things on the table that might not belong there on a every day for the next 10-year basis.
Okay, well, let me ask you this: like okay, say for instance, I wanted to bring up upper chest, delts, and lats, just for instance.
Sure.
Can you do all of those in 5 weeks? Would you have to?
I would argue the more body parts you try to bring up, the less, I mean, how I kept it obvious, like the less dramatic it's going to be on each body part. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like someone saying, can I bring up my upper body? Of course you can, but like I'd rather we did shoulders and arms. Do you know? So typically what I would do is say, let's do chest and back, shoulders and arms and legs. Doing that typically, just separate them off, sort of thing. Do you know? So
5 weeks of chest and back.
So you do 5 weeks of chest and back, and then basically take a break, and then potentially, maybe even cycle it again, because I don't believe that you should change your training program every 5 weeks necessarily. But again, that's contingent on aches and pains, and like the training volume that you're going to be doing. It's very likely that you're going to be saying, look, my elbows hurt and this hurts and that hurts, and this everything needs to be done. There's an old adage to say the best plan is in place until the first shot is fired, and then it's then you start changing the plan. So I would say, yeah, you would set a plan that said 5 weeks, so 4 weeks ascending volume load, deload. The premise would be that at the end of that period, if all is well, you would cycle through that again.
Right. So would you do a little bit and then cycle off for a few weeks? Yeah,
maybe take like this is where you're saying, even like where you talked about. So do we develop a tolerance to these various drugs? Should we be using methylated orals for 60 days? Not in my opinion. Like 30 days and take a break. Doing. Right. So again, the devil is in the detail, but I think the takeaway here is there's a strategic framework that makes sense, but that is different to the grind of the next 10 years.
Okay.
I like to try and separate those two things off, Julian. And I would even say to people, it's like most people have a weak body part or two where you kind of go, you know what, in a year's training, if your whole year's training block looked like this, does it make sense that we spend a period of time focusing on bringing up a weak body part, and turn the volume up a little bit? I'm all for that. I have no problem with that, as long as you balance the stress that you create through that process. Even the training volume is a tremendous amount of stress. The food fatigue that you create, pushing that much food into your body, it's a tremendous amount of stress. So all stress is cumulative. Drug stress, training stress, food stress, the other stresses that we have in life, all stress is cumulative, and you have to manage it if you want to do this over a multi-year time frame. So yeah, as I said, if you want to document it, I'm more than happy to help you out with some guidance about a framework of what I would do, and then you can take that and twist it and turn it and bend it into shape.
I do have some pretty specific questions about, like injection timing, nutrient timing, exactly, like calorie intake. Should it be super high? Should it be, like you said, pyramided up? Should it be just stay normal? If you saw that, so many different things that.
If I can go back to that graphic that I showed you, because I think this. Sorry, hang on a sec. Where's Joe? Because Joe's a good example, because he's sorry, this one here. So I don't know whether you can make this out or not, but you probably can't. But this basically goes back to, let's just say, the 1st of June. Okay, so 1st of June to yesterday. I printed this out yesterday. So you can see this is his scale weight slowly but relentlessly being driven up from 200 pounds to 240 pounds over that time block. Yeah. And you can see his caloric intake is going up as well here. So this is why I try to explain to guys the amount of food that you need to intake to create, to pay the anabolic toll is truly, truly, truly profound. So let's say you did a 12-week block, and I know this is at odds with what I said, but do you remember what I said, like you do one block and then maybe do another block, follow that on? Right. So let's assume we're going to do two follow-on blocks. if you said, right, today my caloric intake is 3,500 calories. Let's just arbitrarily say it's that number, right? So what I would say is, well, you hold your protein and your fats at that same number, but I want you to add 100 grams of carbohydrates. So 25 grams of carbohydrates, 100 calories of carbohydrates every week. Okay. Right. Now that doesn't sound like very much, right? But by the time you get to 12 weeks, that's 1,200 calories more intake. And that's what you can see this line being driven up here. The green is the protein, the red is the fat, the blue is the carbohydrates. Now, the reason we walk it up slowly is, I'm sure you can relate to the fact that we've all done it. And that is, you know, we go into a growth phase and we immediately go to high caloric intake and we get very fat very fast, right? Your body needs time to basically partition these nutrients in a positive fashion. It needs time to adapt. It's a metabolic adaptation process. In the same way that you see negative metabolic adaptation, you can have positive metabolic adaptation. So I would literally say, whatever your maintenance value is now, every week is 100 calories more, 100 calories more, 100 calories more, 100 calories more, 100 calories more. But again, you see how the time frame is starting to push out a little bit more. And with the drug, so for example, we might start off and say, let's say we started on 400 milligrams of testosterone and 100 milligrams of trenbolone. I wouldn't change those. I would keep those as a baseline, okay? And I would use primobolan as the primary growth promoter. In my opinion, it's the perfect drug because you can tolerate a tremendous amount of primobolan. The largest study of anabolic steroids was in primobolan in women at 1,200 milligrams a week in women, right? Yeah. So we can, if there's one drug that we can push at you, again, this is high risk strategy, it's primobolan, okay? So, but we wouldn't just push 1,200 at you because you can't possibly use it all on day one, do you know? So we would start off at say 600 and walk you up and walk you up and walk you up. We would walk everything up. So the training volume gets walked up, the food volume gets walked up, you know, the drugs get walked up. And as I said, this is the time for situational experimental drugs. Absolutely. It's not daily. This isn't a daily application. This is the time. Yeah. And we push them all up with an expectation that over that time frame, we will be putting on your scale weight slowly enough that the scale must relentlessly move, but you don't want to move too quickly because you can only, and this is what I was going back to about these drugs, despite what people think, you can only grow tissue so fast. Right. 2 pounds a month is phenomenal. It's like, fuck, wow, right? So if the scale's got up 5 pounds in a month, why? You mean like a kilogram a month, right? A kilogram a month of quality tissue is a phenomenal month.
Well, right? Yeah, if you can combine the hyperplasia and the hypertrophy.
It's a phenomenal, 2 pounds is, so if you said to me, okay, so I did 2 pounds, 2 pounds, 2 pounds, like you could go, oh crap, I don't fucking recognize myself. Yeah. But again, you're just on the point I'm making. Like I know I'm very repetitive here, but if you said to the average person, I'm going to give you a 1 to 2 pound gain a month, they would turn their nose up at it. Is that, oh fuck, that's pathetic. I'm going, but you have to be patient. In a year, you won't recognize yourself in the mirror. Yeah. So, as I said, I think the best thing for us to do is maybe I can send you across, you know, some spreadsheet, in a spreadsheet format, what I would say the training volume looks like and the food volume looks like, and like a layout of the different drugs that potentially I would use. I was
told really high frequency using the DES was the way to go. But that's, again, that's anecdotal.
I don't have any problem as long as I said, if you've taken on board what I said, saying, okay, so what are we saying here is we don't have any human data here, none. Yeah. All we have is the guy down the gym said, right? Do we really think he's the best, you know, resource in terms of collecting data and knowing what did what? And I honestly, I don't think that guy's the right guy. He doesn't have the right personality. You look at the data I keep, you see that blood glucose, most people think, holy crap, you're a fucking data hound. I keep data on everybody. Do you know what I mean? I'm an engineer by trade. I like this shit. Do you know what I mean? You talk to the average person, he doesn't even keep a training journal. You know, he used DES like 2 years ago. It was phenomenal, but like, do you have a training journal about what you did and your caloric intake and your growth numbers? Like, nah, it's all in here, buddy. It's all in here, bro. Do you know? So you're saying I'm not completely opposed to it, but you can't look at it as a scientist and say that's quality discussion. It's just junk. Right. So if you open that door and say, in this room is anecdotal observation from people that are not very good at anecdotal observation, right? And I'm going to walk around and ask their opinion on it. I don't have a problem in the world with that. I'll tell you what they're going to say. You're going to meet some people that say, I didn't get it. You're going to meet some people that swears it's the best thing ever. You know, you're going to meet some people that use this much. You're going to meet some people that use this much. You know, you're going to have this person had this side effect. You're going to have, but it's the same problem as, I'll give you a simple example. If you talk about the drug Masteron, okay, you will meet people that will tell you that Masteron is the best drug ever. I'm a huge advocate of Masteron, and you'll meet people that say it's complete and absolute fucking waste of time. Right?
I'm using it now, and actually it feels great.
Yeah, it's fabulous. But like, my point is, there's lots of people out there that will say it's a waste of time. All it does is make your hair fall out. Sure. So who's right? This is the problem, is the clinical evidence is what I turn to, and we have fabulous clinical evidence of Masteron to say it does this, this, and this, and this, and this. Okay. So I know that's a very disjointed conversation. It's kind of bouncing around a little bit, but hopefully the total takeaway is, over here are our daily PEDs, human approved, great clinical data. We can talk about them all day. Over here are situational drugs, not approved for human use. Usually there's almost no data on these drugs to speak of. So we rely on anecdote, but unfortunately our tribe is not very good at anecdote, in my opinion. Okay.
There's
there's holes in that conversation, you know, like it's just true, Joanne. So I don't think there's anything wrong with anecdote. It's only good to a point, right? Yeah, up to a point. It's great, as I said, because the problem is you ask someone about Masteron, oh, maybe my hair fall out. It's probably not fucking Masteron then. It's probably testosterone. Do you know what I'm saying? How do you even know that the DES was real?
Right.
During, like the guy that says it did nothing for me. How do you know it was even the real thing? You know, these are all the problems of these discussions. You know,
Victor,
so,
I'll ask a long IGF question, because then you can narrow your answer to it more. So in the more recent mass blast transformations, we would use IGF LR3 and MK677 and injectable growth hormone and insulin also, but more emphasis on the MK677 and IGF LR3. In the previous mass blast, which also went really well, we did more injectable growth hormone and insulin as the way of getting the IGF, so our body's natural conversion to the IGF. And then we switched to using more synthetic IGF. So if we go back to the previous protocols that we did for like the Enhanced 2 movie actually was using LR3 also, but before that, those transformations, it was more HGH. We were doing 5 units of HGH 3 times per day, up to 20 units per day of HGH. And then we would do insulin somewhere between 10 and 30 units per day. But just as an example, it totally depended on the person. 5 units of HGH in the morning with 10 units of insulin, and then repeat that 2 other times during the day. So 15 units of HGH, 30 units of insulin, just as an example of one of the protocols. The IGF conversion that comes from that, do you think, or have you seen, or are there studies on the amount that gets converted and where there's the law of diminishing returns? And if he was going to go the more traditional route of the HGH and the insulin versus the LR3 and the MK677, what's sort of the reasonable dosage if IGF is the priority, or also is IGF less of a priority for you and it's sort of just a secondary thing that comes from another benefit that comes from the more beneficial things that come from HGH and insulin themselves?
Okay, that is a fabulous question. Let me do my best to answer that here. Bearing in mind that we have no clinical evidence to show you on the other analogs. Yeah, so LR3 and DES, there's nothing to show you, right? This is the range of individual response from IGF-1 levels consequential to the same graded doses of recombinant human growth hormone in healthy individuals. In other words, They injected, this is 0.3 IU per kilogram. So for me, I'm 100 kilograms. So this is basically 30, let's just call it 30 international units a day. Okay. Now, the most important thing to you to pick up here is, see these whiskers, these represent the range of individual response to exactly the same dose of recombinant human growth hormone, right? From the same supplier under controlled conditions. It's fucking massive.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? So when you line up 3 guys and you said, we did this, like, do you even know how those guys respond genetically to that drug? Like, it's such a complicated thing to do. Like, so in other words, this is a group of controlled individuals given exactly the same product under laboratory conditions and measured, and you can see the range of individual response to IGF-1. It's like, holy fuck, like, right? So some people out there that were given, if they were 100 kilograms, barely broke fucking 300 nanograms per deciliter. Like, what the fuck? Like, during, like, I can get close to that on 4 units. That would be 30 units, this poor bastard. And then there's another guy up here that's pushing 1,200 units for the same amount. You see what I'm saying? This is where these conversations.
I've seen this in blood work, the same thing. I've seen such variations of IGF. It's mind blowing. It's not just estrogen. There's something else.
But it's everything. The degree of what we call intra-individual genetic response to these drugs is truly, truly, truly profound. And this is where I don't agree with, I did this and it worked. I go, well, that's fabulous. It worked for you. And that's an N equals 1. I don't have any problem with that, but that doesn't mean that everybody should do that. Right?
Oh, audio. Oh, there we go. Got you back.
Oh, sorry. I think I'm back now. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. The only way you can truly do this is you can try it on yourself and see what happens. You at the end of the day, you have to.
That's my approach to everything.
you have to roll up your sleeves and see what does what for you. Right? But, and this is the thing, I know I keep repeating myself like a fucking broken record. All I would ask guys to do is say, listen, in 2020, there's a very, very long list of drugs that I can say to you with great confidence that this stuff is not going to fuck you up. Start with that shit, right? We've been using it for 60 years. We know what it does. We have good clinical evidence. Start with that. Now, if at some point in time you feel that you don't respond well to that, or at some point in time your curiosity killed the cat, got better, and you just can't help yourself, by all means, don't let me get in the way. But the problem is we have this entire generation of kids who are just starting out on their journey, and they're delving into drugs that they don't need to delve into. Just go and buy yourself 100 units of recombinant human growth hormone and take 3 units a day. You don't need to look at IGF-1 levels in an untested human drug to start. That's not where you start the journey. That's where you end the journey, And it may well be the right place for you, but and this is what I'm going to just challenge you a little bit, Mike, on, is don't get me wrong, I think you look fabulous, but if you're telling me that you've capped out your genetic potential and you have to put your hand into that drug of experimental drugs to further progress, I'm going to challenge you. You've got another 25 pounds of muscle on you without having to even go there. So as long as you go, yeah, you're probably right, but I'm going there anyway. Don't let me get in your way. Do you mean? These are the messages I just want to, I'm not trying to tell anyone, I'm nobody's mother. But what I'm saying to you is, so if you said to me, it's a very good question. So if you said to me, so could you show me something like this for these other variants? No, we don't know. Right? So it becomes very, very difficult then to have a credible, conversation about something if you just don't know.
No data is no data.
No data is no data. And then, as I said, doubling up on that is, there's certain individuals that I like in this industry, and I work with them and I share information with them, and I trust the quality of their observations because they're very detail focused. And other people that can't remember what they had for lunch yesterday. So you have to be very careful of who you get your advice from. So
I do have one more question, but it's not really on the same thread. I'm just kind of jumping back and forth. But in your opinion, would there ever be a benefit to using the LR3 and the DES together?
The challenge with that is that it's plausible that they interact with each other in a fashion that we don't desire. Right? Okay. there's actually been several mentions of this in the literature of saying, like, you know, we don't really know the consequence of using this under this circumstances. Does it have a negative impact on, you know, so a classic example is, you know, the insulin-like growth factor 1 binding proteins do things, right? Their role is not simply to bind with IGF-1 and to prevent it from binding with the IGF-1 receptor. There is actually a receptor for the IGF-1 binding protein. So just like sex hormone binding globulin, at a simplistic level, people think, well, all it does is it locks up your fucking, you know, free testosterone. So we want to demolish that. We want to get away with, crush that, as it were. But in reality, there is a sex hormone binding globulin receptor. It has biological function. So whenever we introduce a synthetic version of a compound that doesn't work through the same control pathways or same control mechanisms, you have the risk of saying, look, we don't really understand the full consequence of our actions there. We don't know. Several mentions of exactly that question in the literature, but I don't think anybody can say.
Yeah. Okay, because I've read in some places where you would take the DES either pre or inter-workout, and then you could take the LR3 afterwards. So they're not interfering with one another. You just continue like that.
Yeah, I get, but I guess if you say so, the whole premise of the LR3 was a long half-life.
Yeah.
A lot of people will quote the long half-life as being in the vicinity of 20 hours plus. Yeah. That's a bit of a stretch then to say, okay, so you can use any. I mean, it would need to be a little shorter than that, for that to have merit, in my opinion.
All right.
It's a little bit like Lantus has this is why I like the comparison between insulin and IGF-1, because they're such similar molecules anyway. They're very comparable molecules, and we actually have variants that we can look at. So Lantus has a pharmacokinetics profile of activity of about 20 hours, which is remarkably similar to, LR3. Okay, and then we have a rapid acting insulin, which is very similar. Obviously the pharmacokinetics profile of rapid acting insulin is much longer than an IGF variant. But when you put the two together, it's like, well, okay, so and we can say that because we have human trials where they combine the two in humans. Here's a trial. Here's a group of individuals given some Lantus and some, and rapid acting insulin. What do we see? We don't know is the answer. We don't know. So you can speculate. You can say, I think this might happen. That's great. That's a hypothesis, and all hypotheses are welcome. But who knows until you go and test something? This is, you create a hypothesis and then you test for it. And again, I guess the final statement I said, the last quality evidence that I've seen on these analog variants is from 2011. It's a long time ago.
Yeah.
You have to ask the question, the obvious question I always ask whenever you see these chemicals is, so what's the real story behind why it appears to have been abandoned? I'll give you my opinion. I don't want to scare anyone, but I'll give you my opinion. Usually when drugs are abandoned, it means one of a few things. One is either there's some sort of patent infringement issue that, and there's some sort of legal issue. The drug works great, right? But there's a legal issue, or they find out the drug doesn't do what it said, they thought it was going to do. They're kind of like, there's no point in, just putting more money down this hole sort of thing. My concern is this, and we actually have some evidence to support this. I can show you if you're interested. That, okay, so we have a drug that is more potent than IGF-1. I think that's what we're all saying here, potentially more potent, right? But you understand that that's the yin and the yang to that. When you want that, that's good. And when you don't want that, that's not good. Right. So, they've done testing on, breast cancer cells, and they've shown that, these variants are significantly more impactful on cancer cells in terms of growth promotion. Right. So if you have a drug that is, offering cell promotion and cell growth at an expanded rate, and that cell is what we desire, that seems like a good thing. Now introduce a scenario where, okay, what if they've got a tumor or what if they've got something else? Then you have runaway cancer. Right. One of my feelings is that they just basically made a decision that, these binding proteins exist for a purpose. They are modulators of tumor growth, both in the early and advanced stages of tumor. We know that to be true, right? So when you remove the interaction between IGF-1 and the binding protein, and you accelerate the potential uptake and accelerate the potential of the product, that cuts both ways.
Right. Yeah.
You know? So if someone has a problem, suddenly it's a runaway problem. You know? And this is my honest opinion about this drug, and that is they basically got to the point they said, look, it's just trying to create a drug that bypasses the regulatory consequences of the binding protein for rapid uptake. Sounds fabulous under cachexia and sarcopenia and muscle wasting type application. Sounds great, but what about if the woman has breast cancer or the guy has prostate cancer?
Right.
You know?
That would be a bigger risk with the LR3, would it not?
Well, this is the whole point. It's more impactful, it's faster uptake, it's more potent, Duane. So, and again, there are studies that they looked at IGF-1 variants, and you get rapid tissue growth in tumor in a cancer cell environment as well. Both cuts both ways. Right. My gut feeling is that's why that class of drug has pretty much been abandoned. I think that they've recognized that binding proteins do things and we shouldn't be bypassing them.
Gotcha.
When I started doing, real quick, just my theory behind rapid transformations, one of the theories, back when I started really researching this stuff deeply, let's say 8 years ago, because I decided that's when I started taking steroids. And I knew that there was two main factors in what side effects I was going to get. Well, there's the compound, but the dosage and the frequency, the length that I would take it. Mm-hmm. So I thought, okay, I think most people agree that the dosage, and that's what they're most concerned about, the dosage is what's going to create the side effect. But when I looked at all of the chemicals and all those side effects, a lot of them were more like long-term chronic usage. So then I figured, what about some of these compounds, especially since we don't know what they can do in the long term chronically? What if we used a shorter period of time of the compound at maybe a higher dosage and prioritized not the chronic accumulation of the side effect of it, and then started doing shorter and shorter and shorter blasts and still being able to recreate the same results by making sure that we're hitting every pathway and eliminating every possible limiting factor. So I love the pathway thing that you had up there. I'm gonna look at that more later in your other charts and see if it fits into the pathway chart I made. That it's not yours is technically correct on the biological approach, and then mine's more of the limiting factor approach. So it's sort of like the checklist. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, I've paid attention to growth hormone and the anabolics and the inflammation and the food, but oh, that's right, I forgot. Maybe there's the insulin pathway. So then you can go under the insulin pathway and put what natural things or what unnatural things we're doing to impact that pathway. So that's one of the things that I want to collaborate with you more on later, especially since you have more of the clinical and research and data that can fit into my real world experiments. Mm-hmm.
I talk about this a lot, but I've never spoken to you about this. So let me just explain what I recommend is the right model for most people. Right? It's what I refer to as the supernatural man, right? So the premise of the supernatural man is if you said to someone, okay, how do we feel about 200 milligrams of testosterone a week? Today, most people would consider that TRT. Lots and lots of people out there on 200 milligrams a week just do great, right? Now, put another 50 milligrams a week is not the difference between that's acceptable, that's not. There's a threshold, there's wiggle room there about, so what's the dose? And I think most people could accept, look, somewhere between 250 and 300 milligrams a week of testosterone, depending on the genetic response of the individual, is a very tolerable dose of testosterone, right? That's what my testosterone dose is, 300 milligrams a week, right? Every week, right? I don't take less than that, okay? And I use a little growth hormone, and I use a little insulin, I use a little metformin, I use a little. The doses of most of the drugs I use are very, very close to the clinical doses of these drugs in therapeutic application. but we have polypharmacy at play. So we have the synergism of, moderately modulating all of these metabolic pathways, as I said. And the consequence is, I found that when you're able to do that, you're able to create a hormonal profile that allows you to realize a 1 pound gain in tissue mass in every individual I've ever tried this on, every month, right? Anybody that's sitting there saying, I take 300 milligrams of testosterone, a couple of units of growth hormone, a little bit of insulin, a little bit of metformin, a little bit of this, a little bit of this, and I cannot put on a pound a month. I'm going, dude, you're not eating enough or you're not training hard enough. Do you know? Yes, I do agree. There's always that one individual who's a genetic outlier and whatever. We have to accept that's true. But for most people, most of the time, that amount of growth promotion activity is enough for that result. And we just need to get people to get their head around the fact that that level of drugs doesn't create intolerable degrees of stress, right? You can manage your blood pressure, you can manage blood glucose, you can manage kidneys, you can manage liver, you can manage all of the health markers at that level of exposure and make progress month after month after month. You just need to be emotionally patient enough to say, look, this is a 2 to 3 year journey, not a 2 to 3 month journey. You know, for me to get to point A to point B as Supernatural Man, and I never come off. I don't blast and cruise. I just take a certain amount of drugs that are tolerable to me. And the one time that I deviate from that is if I compete, then I will raise my drug profile to recognize the needs of global competition, right? But there will come a time when I'll stop competing and I will simply take what I call the Supernatural Man cycle, which means it's not TRT. It's disingenuous to say it's TRT. It's not. It's a very moderate and very intelligently designed performance-enhancing drug cycle that is simply not large enough in the doses that we use to create stress that is not manageable over the very long term, okay? Now, contingent across that is I have a fabulous nutritional program. I have a diet rich in fruits and vegetables. I have antioxidant models. I have this, I have that. I have low stress environment. I sleep very well, et cetera, et cetera. But again, I challenge anyone to come to me and say, look, I do that and I can't grow a pound of tissue a month. You know, it's just disingenuous to say that that's not enough. That's not enough drugs. Now, I cover that with saying, look, if you want to be a 300-pound mass monster and you want to stay on the Olympus stage, I'm not your guy, right? But also understand is I'm the guy that's been doing this. I'm 35 years now, doing, and I intend to be doing it for another 25 years. That 300-pound mass monster, you sit and talk to them. I know them. It's for a defined window of time. At some point, they're going to stop. Right? Now, if you meet that individual that says, I just want that and I want that for this many years and then I will stop and I accept the risk profile and if something happens, I'm not critical of that guy at all. Who I'm critical of is the guy that thinks that they can do what they're doing for the next 15 years and there's no consequence to that. You have to stand in one camp or the other, either the camp of longevity, right, which says, just common sense says, look, if you want to do this for the next 35 years, you have to take your foot off the gas, whatever that means, right? And at the same time, we want to balance that against what's the point of taking these drugs and training if you're not making some progress, right? But the progress that I'm putting on the table is more than most people make. And this is the great irony. Most people are not putting a pound of tissue on a month because what happens is they blast and the scale weight goes up 10 pounds and then they come off and they back down to, they lose 9 pounds, right? And the primary reason behind that is they cannot separate the difference between protein accretion and mineral and water retention. These are two different things, and this is why I'm a fan of drugs like Masteron. As I said, because if you put a pound on the scale with Masteron, dude, that's muscle tissue. If you're using Anadrol or using some of these other drugs, dude, I could put on 10 pounds in a week. But that doesn't equate to protein accretion. That's just scale weight change. So yeah, that's my overall strategy. It says, look, if you're interested in it for a long haul and your logic dictates you have to take your foot off the gas, then take those 6 or 7 metabolic pathways and up-regulate them, each of them by a small margin. I would much, much, much rather see a guy take 300 milligrams of testosterone and 3 units of growth hormone and 5 units of Humalog, right, than 750 milligrams of testosterone. Because the 750 milligrams of testosterone is not sustainable, but the other is like, you can make a very good argument that you never have to come off that. And like ever, why? Explain to me why. But if someone wants to say, look, I can stay on 1,000 milligrams of testosterone a week forever, then it's very easy to explain, no, this is why you can't. Okay. So it's just a completely different strategy. I know it's not what we intended to talk about. And I promise if you want some help about putting that strategy together, I'll help you. I just wanted to use this opportunity to talk to my audience and maybe you reach your audience a little bit as well in getting to understand that, like, you have to understand what your goal is and what you want and your time frame, and different people want different things and therefore they need different solutions. But unfortunately, we see guys down the gym that are just recreational trainers wanting to emulate what they see high-risk strategies being deployed by elite athletes are. He used such and such as uses a gram of trenbolone a week, so therefore I need to use a gram of trenbolone a week. It's not required. I use like 150 milligrams of trenbolone a week, and I'm not going to say without irony, back in the day, that's what we used. And people used to use 1 or 2 vials. Sorry, people used to use 2 or 3 vials of trenbolone a week. That was common practice back in the day. It was 140 to 220 milligrams of trenbolone. I'm still there. I'm still living in those days. Why is the trenbolone there? Because trenbolone happens to modulate one of those metabolic pathways, and it's not the androgen receptor. So it's there for a purpose. It's not the primary growth promoter where you would use a tissue selective compound to do that sort of thing. So anyway, I could talk about this for until the cows come home. So I've probably spoken far too long as it is now. So I think most people have fallen asleep now. But is there anything else that we can cover on that subject before we go to meet your needs there, Mike?
I think we covered just about everything.
Okay.
The rest we can cover later on.
Okay. Yeah. If you want to pull me aside privately, we can have just a quick chat about that model. And as I said, I will take no offense if you decide that that's not for you or whatever, but it's something for you to have a look at. Yeah.
No, well, you definitely answered a lot of my questions already.
Yeah. Cool. All right, guys. Thank you for your time.
All right, Victor. Thank you.
We'll have to do this again sometime. I know. That's holy crap. That's almost 2 hours. Crap. All right. Let's do that. Sawadee Cup.
Sawadee Cup.